And this is This Peaceable Land by Robert Charles Wilson. And I love this story. It's, I guess you'd call it an alternate history story. And I wish there were more of these. I mean, because history can be so random, you know? I mean, what if this had happened instead of that happening? What would have happened then? How would things have turned out? You know, I love that whole concept. Anyway, this is a good one. This Peaceable Land. It's worth your life to go up there, the tavern keeper's wife said. What do you want to go up there for anyway? The property's for sale, I said. Property. The landlady of the roadside tavern nearly spat out the word. There's nothing up there but sandhills and saggy old sheds. That and a family of crazy colored people. Someone claims they sold you that? You ought to check with the bank, mister. See about getting your money back. She smiled at her own joke, showing tobacco-stained teeth. In this part of the country, there were spittoons in every tap room and Bull Durham advertisements on every wall. It was 1895. It was August. It was hot. We were in the South. I was only posing as an investor. I had no money in all the baggage I was carrying. Very little, anyhow. I had photographic equipment instead. You go up those hills, the tavern keeper's wife said more soberly. You carry a gun, and you keep it handy. I mean that. I had no gun. I wasn't worried about what I might find up in the Pine Barrens. I was worried about what I would tell my daughter. I paid the lady for the meal she'd served me, and for a second meal she'd put up in a neat small box. I asked her whether a room was available for the night. There was. We discussed the arrangements and came to an agreement. Then I went out to where Percy was waiting in the carriage. You'll have to sleep outside, I said. The landlady says she'll bring you a box breakfast in the morning, as long as there's nobody around to see her. Percy nodded. None of this came as a surprise to him. He knew where he was and who he was and what was expected of him. And then he said, we'll drive up to the place, weather permitting. Percy was always the place, each place we found. Storm clouds had dallied along this river valley all the hot day, but no rain had come. If it came tonight, and if it was torrential, the dirt roads would quickly become useless creeks of mud. We would be stuck here for days. And Percy would get wet, sleeping in the carriage as he did. But he preferred the carriage to the stable where our horses were put up. The carriage was covered with rubberized cloth. It was a big sheet of mosquito netting he stretched over the open places during the night. But a truly stiff rain was bound to get in the cracks and make him miserable. Percy Camber was an educated black man. He wrote columns and articles for The Tocsin, a Negro paper published out of Windsor, Canada. 3 years ago, a Boston press had put out a book he'd written, though he admitted the sales had been slight. I wondered what the landlady would say if I told her Percy was a book writer. Most likely she would have denied the possibility of an educated black man, except perhaps as a circus act, like that Barnum horse that counts to 10 with its hoof. Make sure your gear is ready first thing, Percy said, keeping his voice low, although there was nobody else about. This was a poor tavern on a poor road in an undeveloped county. And don't drink too much tonight, Tom, if you can help it. That's sound advice, I agreed, by way of not pledging an answer. Oh, the keeper's wife tells me we ought to carry a gun. Wild men up there, she says. I don't go armed, nor do I. I guess we'll be prey for the wild men, said Percy, smiling. The room where I spent the night was not fancy, which made me feel better about leaving my employer to sleep out of doors. It was debatable which of us was better off. The carriage seat where Perry curled up was not infested with fleas, as was the mattress on which I lay. Percy customarily slept on a folded jacket, while my pillow was a sugar sack stuffed with corn huskings, which rattled beneath my ears as if the Beatles inside were putting on a musical show. I slept a little, woke up, scratched myself, lit the lamp, took a drink. I will not drink, I told myself as I poured the liquor. I will not drink to excess. I will not become drunk. I will only calm the noise in my head. My companion in this campaign was a bottle of rye whiskey. Mr. Whiskey Bottle, unfortunately, was only half full, not up to the task assigned him. I drank, but kept on thinking unwelcome thoughts. The night simmered and creaked with insect noises. Why do you have to go away for so long? Elspeth asked me. In this incarnation, she wore a white dress. Looked like a christening dress. She was 13 years old. Taking pictures, I told her, same as always. Why can't you take pictures at the portrait studio? These are different pictures, Elsie. Kind you have to travel for. Her flawless young face took on an accusatory cast. Mama says you're stirring up old trouble. She says you're poking into things nobody wants to hear about anymore, much less see photographs of. She may be right, but I'm being paid money, and money buys pretty dresses, among other good things. Why make such trouble, though? Why do you want to make people feel bad? Elise was a phantom. I blinked her away. These were questions she'd not actually posed, though our last conversation before I left Detroit had come uncomfortably close. But they were questions I would sooner or later have to answer. I slept very little, despite the drink. Woke up before dawn. I inventoried my photographic equipment by lamplight, just to make sure everything was ready. It had not rained during the night. I settled up with the landlady and removed my baggage from the room. Percy had already hitched the horses to the carriage. The sky was drab under high cloud, saw a spot of light like a candle flame burning through a linen handkerchief. The landlady's husband was nowhere to be seen. He'd gone down to Crib Lake for supplies, she said. She packed up 2 box lunches, cold cuts of beef with pickles and bread, which I had requested of her. She had 2 adult sons living with her, one of whom I had met in the stables, and she felt safe enough, she told me, even with her husband absent. We're a long way from anywhere, she added. The traffic along this road has been light ever since the lodge closed down. I wasn't kidding about those sandhills, mister. Be careful up there. We mean to be back by nightfall, I said. My daughter Elspeth had met Percy Camber just once when he came to the house in Detroit to discuss his plans with me. Elspeth had been meticulously polite to him. Percy had offered her his hand, and she, wide-eyed, had taken it. You're very neatly dressed, she had said. She was not used to well-dressed black men. The only blacks Elspeth had seen were the day laborers who gathered on the wharves. Detroit housed a small community of Negroes who had come north with the decline of slavery before Congress passed the Labor Protection Act. They did the jobs white men won't do, for wages to which white men would not submit. You're very prettily dressed yourself, Percy Camber said, ignoring the unintended insult. Maggie, my wife, had simply refused to see him. I'm not some radical old Congregationalist, she told me, eager to socialize with every tawny Moor who comes down the pike. That's your side of the family, Tom, not mine. True enough. Maggie's people were Episcopalians who had prospered in Michigan since before it was a state. Sturdy, reliable folks. They ran a string of warehouses that catered to the lake trade. My father was a disappointed Whig who spent a single term in the Massachusetts legislature pursuing the chimera of free education before he died at an early age. My mother's bookshelves still groaned under the weight of faded tomes on the subjects of enlightened marriage and women's suffrage. I came from a genteel family of radical tendencies and modest means. I was never sure Maggie's people understood that poverty and gentility could truly coexist. Maggie's indisposed today, I told Percy, who may or may not have believed me, and we had settled down to the business of planning our 3-month tour of the South, according to the map he had made. There ought to be photographs, Percy said, before it's all gone. We traveled several miles from the tavern, sweating in the airless heat of the morning, following directions Percy had deduced from bills of transfer, railway records, and old advertisements placed in the Richmond and Atlanta papers. The locality to which we were headed had been called Pilgassy Acres. It had been chartered as a business by 2 brothers, Marcus and Benjamin Pilgassy of South Carolina, in 1879. It had operated for 5 years before the Ritter Inquiry shut it down. There were no existing photographs of Pilgassy Acres, or any of the institutions like it, unless the Ritter Inquiry had commissioned them. The final report of the Ritter Inquiry had been sealed from the public by consent of the Congress, not to be reopened until sometime in the 20th century. Percy Camber intended to shed some light into that officially ordained darkness. He sat with me on the driver's board of the carriage as I coaxed the team over the rutted and runneled trail. This had once been a wider road, much used, but it had been passed by a federal turnpike in 1887. Since then, nature and the seasons had mauled it, so the ride was tedious and slow. We subdued the boredom by swapping stories. Percy of his home in Canada, me of my time in the army. Percy talked white. That was the verdict Elsbeth had passed after meeting him. It was a condescending thing to say, excusable only from the lips of a child, but I knew what she meant. Percy was 2 generations out of slavery. If I closed my eyes and listened to his voice, I could imagine I had been hired by some soft-spoken Harvard graduate. He was articulate, even for a newspaper man. We learned over the course of our lengthy expedition to make allowances for our differences. We had some common ground. We're both the offspring of radical parents. For example, the madness of the 50s had touched us both in different ways. You suppose we'll find anything substantial at the end of the road? Percy asked. The landlady mentioned some old sheds. Sheds would be acceptable, Percy said, his weariness showing. It's been a long haul for you, Tom. Not much substantial work. Maybe this time. Maybe. Documents, oral accounts, that's all useful. But a photograph, just one, to just show that something remains. That would be important. I'll photograph any old shed you like, Percy, if it pleases you. Though on this trip I had seen more open fields, long since burned over and regrown, than anything worthy of being immortalized. Places edited from history. Absences constructed as carefully as architecture. I had no reason to think Pilgassy Acres would be different. Percy seldom spoke out loud about the deeper purpose of his quest, for the book he was currently writing. Fair enough, I thought. It was a sensitive subject. The way I don't talk much about Cuba. I had served a year and a half there under Lee. The spot is too tender to touch. These hills were low and covered with stunted pines and other rude vegetation. The road soon grew even more rough. We began to encounter evidence of a prior human presence. A few fence posts, scraps of rusted barbed wire, traces of an old narrow-gauge rail bed. And we passed under a wooden sign suspended between 2 lodge poles, on which the words Pilgassy Acres in an ornate script were still legible, though the seasons had bleached the letters to ghosts. There was also the remains of a wire fence, tangled over with brambles. Stop here, Percy said. Might be more ahead, I suggested. This is already more than we've seen elsewhere. I want a picture of that sign. I can't guarantee it'll be legible, I said, given the way the sun was striking it and the faint color of the letters, pale as chalk on the white wood. Well, try, Percy said shortly. So I set up my equipment and did that. For the first time in a long while, I felt as though I was earning my keep. The first book Percy had written was called Every Measure Short of War. It was a history of abolitionism from the Negro point of view. The one he was writing now was to be called Where Are the 3 Million? I made a dozen or so exposures and put my gear back in the carriage. Percy took the reins this time, urged the horses farther up the trail. Scrub grass and runt pines closed in on both sides of us. I found myself watching the undergrowth for motion. The landlady's warning had come back to haunt me. But the woods were empty. An old stray dog paced us for a few minutes, then fell behind. My mother had once corresponded with Mrs. Harriet Beecher Stowe, who was a well-known abolitionist at one time. The name is now mostly forgotten. Percy had contacted my parents in order to obtain copies of that correspondence, which he had quoted in an article for the Tocsin. My mother, of course, was flattered. She continued her correspondence with Percy on an occasional basis. In one of his replies, Percy happened to remark that he was looking for a reliable photographer to hire for the next project he had in mind. My mother, of course, sent him to me. Perhaps she thought she was doing me a favor. Thus it was not money but conscience that had propelled me on this journey. Conscience, it crabbed and nagged, which inevitably spoke, whether I heeded it or not, in a voice much like my mother's. The remains of Pilgassy Acres became visible as we rounded a final bend. I was frankly astonished that so much of it remained intact. Percy Camber drew in his breath. Here were the administrator's quarters, a small building with pretensions to the colonial style, as well as 5 huge barn-like buildings, fragments of paving stones and mortared brick, where more substantial structures had been demolished. All silent, all empty. No glass in the small windows. The breeze, like the breath from a hard coal stove, seeped through the buildings and tousled the meadow weeds that lapped at them. There was the smell of old wood that had stood in the sunlight for a long time. There was beneath that the smell of something less pleasant, like an abandoned latrine, doused with lime and left to simmer in the heat. Percy was working to conceal his excitement. He pretended to be casual, but I could see that every muscle in him had gone tense. "Your camera, Tom," he said, as if the scene were in some danger of evaporating before our eyes. "You don't want to explore the place a little first?" "Not yet. I want to capture it as we see it now, from a distance, all the buildings, all together." And I did that. The sun, though masked by light-high clouds, was a feverish nuisance over my right shoulder. I thought of my daughter, Elsbeth. She would see these pictures some day. "What place is this?" she would ask. What would I say in return? Any answer I could think of amounted to drilling a hole in her innocence and pouring poison in. Every measure short of war, the title of Percy's first book, implied that there might have been one, a war over abolition, that is, a war between the states. My mother agreed. But it was not the North that would have brought it on, she insisted. A conversation we had had on the eve of my marriage to Maggie. People forget how sullen the South was in the years before the Douglas Compromise, how fierce in the defense of slavery, their peculiar institution. Strange, isn't it? How people cling most desperately to a thing when it becomes least useful to them. My mother's dream, and Mrs. Stowe's, for that matter, had never been achieved. No abolition by federal statute had ever been legislated. Slavery had simply become unprofitable, as its milder opponents and apologists used to insist it inevitably would. Scientific farming killed it. Crop rotation killed it. Deep plowing killed it. Mechanized harvesters killed it. Soil fertilization killed it. Embarrassment killed it, when Southern farmers began to take seriously the condescension and disapproval of the European powers whose textile and tobacco markets they craved. Organized labor killed it. Ultimately, the expense and absurdity of maintaining human beings as farm chattel killed it. Few slaves were still held under permissive state laws in Virginia and South Carolina, for example. They tended to be the pets of the old planter aristocracy, kept as pets might be kept, because the children of the household had grown fond of them and objected to their eviction. I walked with Percy Camber through the abandoned administration buildings at Pelgusy Acres. It had been stripped of everything, all furniture, every document, any scrap that might have testified to its human utility. Even the wallpaper had peeled or rotted away. One well-placed lightning strike would have burned the whole thing to the ground. Its decomposing stairs were too hazardous to attempt. Animals had covered the floorboards with dung, and birds lofted out of every room we opened. Our progress could have been charted by the uprising of the swallows and the indignation of the owls. "It's just an empty building," I said to Percy, who had been silent throughout the visit, his features knotted and tense. "Empty of what, though?" he asked. I took a few more exposures on the outside. The crumbling pillars, the worm-tunneled veranda casting a sinister shade, the chimney leaning sideways like a drunken man. I did not believe, could not bring myself to believe, that a war within the boundaries of the Union could ever have been fought, though historians still worry about that question like a loose tooth. If the years after '55 had been less prosperous, if Douglas had not been elected president, if the terrorist John Brown had not been tried in a northern court and hanged on a northern gallows, if, and on to infinity. All nonsense, it seemed to me. Whatever Harriet Beecher Stowe might have dreamed, whatever Percy Camber might have uncovered, this was fundamentally a peaceable land. "This is a peaceable land," I imagined myself telling my daughter, Elsbeth. My imagination would extend itself no farther. "Now the barracks," Percy said. It had been even hotter in the administration building than it was outside. Percy's clothes were drenched through. So were mine. "You mean those barns?" "Barracks," Percy repeated. Barracks or barns. There were little of both, as it turned out. The one we inspected was a cavernous wooden box, held up by mildew and inertia. Percy wanted photographs of the rusted iron brackets that had supported rows of wooden platforms. Few of these remained, on which men and women had once slept. There were a great many of these brackets. I estimated that a single barracks barn might have housed as many as 200 persons in its day, even larger number of if mattresses had been laid on the floors. I took the pictures he wanted by the light that came through fallen boards. The air in the barn was stale, despite all the holes in the walls. It was a relief to finish my work and step out into the relentless, dull sunshine. The presence of so many people must have necessitated a dining hall, a communal kitchen, sanitary facilities at Pilgrim Acres. These structures had not survived except as barren patches among the weeds. Dig down a little. Percy had learned this technique in his research, and you would find a layer of charcoal for each burned building or outhouse. Not every structure in Pilgrim Acres had survived the years, but each had left its subtle mark. One of the 5 barns was not like the others. I made this observation to Percy Camber as soon as I noticed it. The rest of these barracks, the doors and windows are open to the breeze. The far one in the north quarter has been boarded up. Do you see? That's the one we should inspect next, then, Percy said. We're on our way there when the first bullet struck. My mother had always been an embarrassment to me, with her faded enthusiasms, her Bible verses and Congregationalist poetry, missionary zeal on behalf of people whose lives were so tangential to mine that I could barely imagine them. She didn't like it when I volunteered for Cuba in 1880. It wasn't a proper war, she said. She said it was yet another concession to the South, to the aristocracy's greed for expansion toward the equator. A war engineered at the Virginia Military Institute, she called it, fought for no good reason. But it blended Northerners and Southerners on a neutral field of battle. We're all just American soldiers. It was a glue that repaired many ancient sectional rifts. Out of it emerged great leaders, like old Robert E. Lee, who transcended regional loyalties. Though when he spoke of America, I often suspected he used the word as a synonym for Virginia, and his son, also a talented commander. In Cuba, we all wore a common uniform. We all learned, rich and poor, north and south, to duck the Spaniards' bullets. The bullet hit a shed wall just above Percy Camber's skull. Splinters flew through the air like a cloud of mosquitoes. The sound of the gunshot arrived a split second later, damped by the humid afternoon, to a harmless-sounding pop. The rifleman was some distance away, but he was accurate. I dropped to the ground. I rather discovered that I'd already dropped to the ground, obeying an instinct swifter than reason. Percy, who had never been to war, lacked that ingrained impulse. I'm not sure he understood what had happened. He stood there in the rising heat, bewildered. "Get down," I said. "What is it, Tom?" "You are doomed if you don't get down. Get down!" He understood then. It was as if the excitement had loosened all the strings of his body. He couldn't decide which way to fold. It was a picture of confusion. And a second bullet struck him in the shoulder. Liberty lodges, they had been called at first. I mean the places like Pilgrim Acres, back when they were allowed to flourish. They were a response to a difficult time. Slavery had died. The slaves had not. That was the dilemma of the South. Black men without skills, along with their families and countless unaccompanied children, crowded the roads, more of them every day, as free labor cotton became a rallying cry for progressive French and English buyers. Who were Marcus and Benjamin Pilgassi? Probably nothing more than a pair of Richmond investors jumping on a bandwagon. The Liberty Lodges bore no onus then. The appeal of the business was explicit. Don't put your slaves on the road and risk prosecution or fines for abandonment of property. We'll take your aging and unprofitable chattel and house them. The men will be kept separate from the women to prevent any reckless reproduction. They will live out their lives with their basic needs attended to for an annual fee of only a fraction of what it would cost to keep them privately. What the Pilgassi's brothers, and businessmen like them, did not say directly, but implied it in every line of their advertisements, was that Liberty Lodge movement aimed to achieve an absolute and irreversible decline in the Negro population in the South. In time, Percy had told me, the clients of these businesses came to include entire state governments, which are tired of the expense and notoriety incurred by the existence of temporary camps in which tens of thousands of intramural refugees could neither be fed economically nor be allowed to starve. It had been less onerous for them to subsidize the lodges, which tended to be built in isolated places away from casual observation. Percy's grandfather had escaped slavery in the 1830s and settled in Boston, where he picked up enough education to make himself prominent in the abolition movement. Percy's father, an ordained minister, had spoken at Lyman Beecher's famous church in the days before he founded the journal that became the Tocsin. Percy had taken up the moral burden of his forebears in a way I had not, but there was still a similarity between us. We were the children of crusaders. We'd inherited their disappointments and drunk the lees of their bitterness. I was not a medical man. I'd witnessed bullet wounds in Cuba. Percy had been shot in the shoulder. He lay on the ground with his eyes open, blinking, his left hand pressed against the wound. I pried his hand away so that I could examine his injury. The wound was bleeding badly. The blood did not spurt out, a good sign. I took a handkerchief from my pocket, folded it, and pressed it against the hole. Am I dying? Percy asked. I don't feel like I'm dying. You're not all that badly hurt, or you wouldn't be talking. You need attention, though. A third shot rang out. Couldn't tell where the bullet went. And we need to get under cover, I added. The nearest building was the boarded-up barracks. I told Percy to hold the handkerchief in place. His right arm didn't seem to work correctly, perhaps because the bullet had damaged some bundles of muscles or nerves. But I got him crouching, and we hurried toward shelter. We came into the shadow of the building and stumbled to the side of it, away from the direction from which the shots had come. Grasshoppers buzzed out of the weeds in fierce brown flurries, some of them lighting on our clothes. There was a sound of dry thunder down the valley. The barracks had a door, a wooden door on a rail, large enough to admit dozens of people at once. But it was closed. There was a brass latch and a padlock on it. So we had no real shelter, just some shade and a moment's peace. I used the time to put a fresh handkerchief on Percy's wound and to bind it with a strip of cloth torn from my own shirt. Thank you, Percy said breathlessly. Welcome. The problem now was how to get back to the carriage. We had no weapons. We could hardly withstand a siege, no matter where we hid. Our only hope was escape. I could not see any likely way of achieving it. And the question became moot, for the man who had aimed to kill us came around the corner of the barracks. Why do you want to make these pictures? Elsie asked yet again from a dim cavern at the back of my mind. In an adjoining chamber of my skull, a different voice reminded me that I wanted a drink, a strong one, immediately. The ancient Greeks, I imagined myself telling Elspeth, believed that vision is a force that flies out from the eyes when directed by the human will. They were wrong. There's no force or will in vision. There's only light. Light direct or light reflected. Light which behaves in predictable ways. Put a prism in front of it and it breaks into colors. Open a shuttered lens and some fraction of it can be trapped in ultracellulose or collodion as neatly as a bug in a killing jar. A man with a camera is like a naturalist, I told Elsbeth. Where one man might catch butterflies, another catches wasps. I did not make these pictures. I only caught them. The man with the rifle stood 5 or 6 yards away at the corner of the barracks. He was a black man in threadbare coveralls. He was sweating in the heat. For a while there was silence, the three of us blinking at each other. Then, I didn't mean to shoot him, the black man said. Then you shouldn't have aimed a rifle at him and pulled the trigger, I said back recklessly. Our assailant made no immediate response. He seemed to be thinking this over. Grasshoppers lit on the cuffs of his ragged pants. His head was large, his hair cut crudely close to the skull. His eyes were narrow and suspicious. He was barefoot. It was not my intention to hurt anyone, he said again. I was shooting from a distance, sir. By this time, Percy had managed to sit up. He seemed less afraid of the rifleman than he ought to have been. Less afraid at any rate than I was. What did you intend? He gave his attention to Percy. To warn you away, is all. Away from what? This building. Why? What's in this building? My son. The 3 million in Percy's title were the men, women, and children of African descent held in bondage in the South in the year 1860. For obvious reasons, the number is approximate. Percy always tried to be conservative in his estimates. We did not want to be vulnerable to accusations of sensualizing history. Given that number to begin with, what Percy had done was to tally up census polls where they existed, alongside the archived report of various state and local governments, tax and business statements, federal surveys, rail records, etc., over the years between then and now. What befell the 3 million? A great many, as many as 1/3, emigrated north, before changes in the law made that difficult. Some of those who migrated continued on up to Canada. Others made lives for themselves in the big cities. insofar as they were allowed to. A smaller number were taken up against their will and shipped to certain inhospitable colonies in Africa, till the excesses and horrors of repatriation became notorious. The whole enterprise was outlawed. Some found a place among the freemen of New Orleans, worked boats largely unmolested along the Gulf Coast. A great many went west, where they were received with varying degrees of hostility. 5,000 irredeemably criminal black prisoners were taken from southern jails and deposited in a Utah desert, where they died not long after. Certain jobs remained open to black men and women, as servants, rail porters, and so forth. Many did well enough in these professions. But add the numbers, Percy said, even with a generous allowance for error, still comes up shy of the requisite 3 million. How many were delivered into the Liberty Lodges? No one can answer that question with any certainty. It's not until the evidence sealed by the Ritter inquiry is open to the public. Percy's estimate was somewhere in the neighborhood of 50,000. As I said, he tended to be conservative in his figures. We were warned there was a family of wild men up here, I said. I'm no wilder than I have to be, the gunman said. I didn't ask you to come visit. You hurt Percy bad enough, whether you're wild or not. Look at him. He needs a medic. I see him all right, sir. Then unless you mean to shoot us both to death, will you help me get him back to our carriage? There was another lengthy pause. I don't like to do that, the black man said finally. There won't be any end to the trouble. I don't suppose I have a choice, except as you say, to kill you. That I cannot bring myself to do. He said these words calmly enough, but he had a way of forming his vowels, pronouncing them deep in his throat, that defies transcription. It's like listening to a volcano rumble. Take his right arm, then, I said. I'll get on his left. The carriage is beyond that ridge. I know where the carriage is, but, sir, I won't put down this rifle. I don't think that would be wise. You can help him yourself. I went to where Percy sat and began to lift him up. Percy startled me by saying, No, Tom, I don't want to go to the carriage. What do you mean? The assailant asked before I could pose the same question. Do you have a name? Percy asked him. Ephraim, the man said reluctantly. Ephraim, my name is Percy Camber. What do you mean when you said your son was inside the barracks? I don't like to tell you that, Ephraim said, shifting his gaze between Percy and me. Percy, I said, you need a doctor. We're wasting time. He looked at me sharply. I'll live a while longer. Let me talk to Ephraim, please, Tom. Stand off there where I can see you, sir, Ephraim directed. I know this man needs a doctor. I'm not stupid. This won't take long. I concluded from all this that the family of wild Negroes that the landlady had warned me about was real. They were living in the sealed barn. Why they should want to inhabit such a place I could not say. I stood apart while Percy, wounded as he was, held a hushed conversation with Ephraim, who had shot him. I understood they could talk more freely without me as an auditor. I was a white man. It was true that I worked for Percy. That fact would not have been obvious to Ephraim, any more than it had been obvious to the dozens of hotel keepers who had assumed, without asking, that I was the master. Percy was the servant. My closeness to Percy was unique and all but invisible. After a while, Ephraim allowed me to gather up my photographic gear, which had been scattered in the crisis. I'd been fascinated by photography even as a child. It seemed like such patent magic. The magic of stopped time, places and person rescued from their ephemeral natures. My parents had given me books containing photographs of Indian elephants, the pyramids of Egypt, the natural wonders of Florida. I put my gear together and waited for Percy to finish his talk with the armed lunatic who had shot him. The high cloud that had polluted the sky all morning had dissipated during the afternoon. The air was still scalding hot. It was a touch less humid. A certain brittle clarity had set in. The light was hard, crystalline. Fine light for photography. It was beginning to grow long. Percy, I called out. What is it, Tom? We have to leave now, before the sun gets any lower. It's a long journey to Crib Lake. There was a doctor at Crib Lake. I remembered seeing his shingle when we passed through that town. Some rural bone setter, probably. A dowdy relic of the mustard plaster era. But better than no doctor at all. Percy's voice sounded weak. What he said was, We're not finished here yet. What do you mean, not finished? We've been invited inside, he said, to see Ephraim's son. Some bird, perhaps a mourning dove, called out from the gathering shadows among the trees where the meadow ended. I did not want to meet Ephraim's son. There's a dreadful aspect to the whole affair. If Ephraim's son was in the barn, why had he not come out at the sound of gunshots and voices? Ephraim, as far as I could tell, was an old man. Son wasn't likely to be an infant. Why, for that matter, was the barracks closed and locked? To keep the world away from Ephraim's son? Or to keep Ephraim's son away from the world? What's his name? I asked. This son of yours. Jordan, he said. I'd married Maggie not long after I got back from Cuba. Been trying to set up my photography business at the time. I was far from wealthy. What resources I had, I put into my business. But there was a vogue among young women with a better type for manly veterans. I was manly enough, I suppose, or at least presentable, and I was authentically a veteran. I met Maggie when she came to my shop to sit for a portrait. I escorted her to dinner. Maggie was fond of me, and I was fond of Maggie, in part because she had no political convictions or fierce, unorthodox ideals. She took the world as she found it. Elsbeth came along a year or so after the wedding. It was a difficult birth. I remember the sound of Maggie's screams. I remember Elsbeth as a newborn, bloody in a towel handed to me by the doctor. I wiped the remnant blood and fluid from her tiny body. She'd been unspeakably beautiful. Ephraim wore the key to the barn on a string around his neck. He applied it to the massive lock, still giving me suspicious glances. He kept his rifle in the crook of his arm as he did this. He slid the huge door open. Inside the barn was dark. The air that wafted out was a degree or two cooler than outside. It carried a sour tang, as of long rotten hay or clover. Ephraim did not call out his son. There was no sound inside the abandoned barracks. Had Ephraim once held his newborn son in his arms, as I had held Elsbeth? The last of the Liberty Lodges were closed down in 1888. Scandal had swirled around them for years, but no sweeping legal action had been taken. In part, this was because the lodges were not a monolithic enterprise. 100 independent companies held title to them. In part, it was because various state legislatures were afraid of disclosing their own involvement. The lodges had not proved as profitable as the founders expected. The plans had not anticipated, for instance, all the ancillary costs of keeping human beings confined in what amounted to a jail, guards, walls, fences, discipline, etc., for life. But the utility of the lodges was undisputed. Several states had quietly subsidized them. A full accounting, as Percy called it, would have tainted every government south of the Mason-Dixon line, and not a few above it. Old wounds might have been reopened. The Ritter Inquiry was called by Congress when the abuse inherent to the lodge system began to come to light, inch by inch. By that time, though, there had been many other scandals, many other inquests. The public had grown weary of all such issues. Newspapers, apart from papers like the Tocsin, hardly touched the story. Inquiry sealed its own evidence. The surviving lodges were hastily dismantled. The general population, apart from a handful of aged reformers, paid no significant attention. Why dredge up all that ugliness? Maggie had asked me. Nobody wants to see those pictures, Elsbeth whispered. Nobody but a few old scolds. It was too dark in the immense barracks to be certain, but it seemed to me there was nobody inside but the three of us. I came here with Jordan in '78, Ephraim said. Jordan was 12 years old at the time. I don't know what happened to his mama. We got separated at the federal camp on the Kansas border. Jordan and I were housed in different buildings. He looked around, his eyes abstracted, seemed to see more than an old and ruined barracks. Perhaps he could see in the dark. It was dark in there, only light coming through the fractionally opened door. All I could see was a board floor, immaculately swept, picked out in that wedge of sun. All else was shadow. He found an old crate for Percy to sit on. The crate was the only thing like furniture I could see. There was nothing to suggest a family resided here apart from the neatness, the sealed entrances and windows, the absence of bird dung. I began to feel impatient. You said your son was here, I prompted him. Oh, yes, sir. Jordan's here. Where? I don't see him. Percy shot me an angry look. He's everywhere in here, the madman said. Oh, I thought, it's not Jordan then. It's the spirit of Jordan, or some conceit like that. This barn is a shrine the man has been keeping. I had the unpleasant idea that Jordan's body might be tucked away in one of its shadowed corners, dry and lifeless as an old Egyptian king. Or at least, Ephraim said, for about 8 foot down. He found and lit a lantern. One evening in the midst of our journey through the South, I had gotten drunk and shared with Percy my idea that we were really very much alike. This was in Atlanta, one of the hotels that provides separate quarters for colored servants traveling with their employers. That was good because it meant Percy could sleep in relative comfort. I'd snuck down to his room, which was little more than a cubicle. I brought a bottle with me, but Percy refused to share it. He was an abstinent man. I talked freely about my mother's fervent abolitionism, how it hovered over my childhood like a storm cloud stitched with lightning. I told Percy how we were both the children of idealists, and so forth. He listened patiently, but at the end, I had finally run down. My jaw was too weary to continue. He rummaged through the papers he carried with him, drew out a letter that had been written to him by Mrs. Harriet Beecher Stowe. Mrs. Stowe is best remembered for her work on behalf of the China Inland Mission. She came from an abolitionist family. Her father was the first president of the famous Lane Theological Seminary. At one point in her life, she had attempted a novel meant to expose the evils of slavery, but she could not find a publisher. Percy handed me the woman's letter. I've received your book, Every Measure Short of War, the letter began. It brings back terrible memories and forebodings. I remember all too distinctly what it meant to love my country in those troubled years, to tremble at the coming day of wrath. You want me to read this? I asked drunkenly. Just that next part, Percy said. Perhaps because of your book, Mr. Camber, Mrs. Stowe wrote, because of the memory it aroused, I suffered an unbearable dream last night. It was about that war. I mean, the war that was so much discussed, but that never took place. The war from which both North and South stepped back as from the brink of a terrible abyss. In my dream, that precipice loomed again. This time there was no Stephen Douglas to call us away with concessions and compromises as disgusting deference to the slave aristocracy. In my dream, the war took place. It was an awful war, Mr. Camber. It seemed to flow before my eyes in a series of bloody tableaus. 500,000 dead, battlefields too awful to contemplate. North and South, industries crippled, both the print and the cotton presses silenced, thriving cities reduced to smoldering ruins. All this I saw or knew as one sees or knows in dreams. That was not the unbearable part of it. Let me say that I have known death altogether too intimately. I've suffered the loss of children. I love peace just as fervently as I despise injustice. I would not wish grief or heartbreak on any mother of any section of this country or any other country, and yet, in light of what I've inferred from recent numbers of your newspaper and from the letters you've written me, what old friends and acquaintances have said or written about the camps, the deportations, the lodges, etc., because of all that, a part of me wishes it might have ended slavery, ended it cleanly, with sane and straightforward liberation, or even a liberation partial and incomplete. A declaration, at least, of the immorality and unacceptability of human bondage. Anything but this sickening decline by extinction, this surreptitious, as you so bitterly describe it, cleansing. I suppose it makes me sound like a monster, sort of female John Brown, confusing righteousness with violence and murder with redemption. I am not such a monster. I confess a certain admiration for those who, like President Douglas, worked so very hard to prevent the apocalypse from which I dreamed last night, even if I distrust their motives and condemn their means. The instinct for peace is the most honorable of all Christian impulses. My conscience rebels at a single death, much less 1 million. But if a war could have ended slavery, would I have wished it, welcomed it? What is unbearable, Mr. Camber, is I don't know that I can answer my own horrifying question, either honestly or decently. So I have to ask, can you? I puzzled it out, and I gave Percy a blank stare. Why are you showing me this? We're alike in many ways, as you say, Tom, but not always. Not always. Mrs. Stowe asks an interesting question. Answering it isn't easy. I don't know your mind, but fundamentally, Tom, despite all the sympathies between us, the fact is, I suspect that in the end you might give the wrong answer to that question. I expect you think the same of me. There was another difference which I did not mention to Percy. That was that every time I remarked on our similarities, I could hear my wife's scornful voice saying, as she had said when I first shared the idea of this project with her, "Oh, Tom, don't be ridiculous. You're nothing like that Percy Camber. That's your mother talking. All that abolitionist guilt she burdens you with, as if you need to prove you haven't betrayed the cause, whatever the cause is exactly." Maggie failed to change my mind, and what she said was true. "From about 8 feet down," Ephraim said cryptically, lifting the lantern. 8 feet is as high as an average man can reach without standing on something. Between 8 feet and the floor is the span of a man's reach. "You see, sir," Ephraim said, "my son and I were held in separate barracks. The idea behind that was that a man might be less eager to escape if it meant leaving behind a son or father or uncle. The overseers said, if you run, your people will suffer for it. When my chance came, I took it. I don't know if that's a sin. I think about it often." He walked toward the nearest wall, the lantern breaking up the darkness as it swayed in his grip. "This barracks here was my son's barracks." "Were there many escapes?" Percy asked. I began to see that something might have been written on the wall. At first it looked more like an idea of writing, a text as crabbed and indecipherable as the scratchings of the Persians. "Yes, many," Ephraim said, "though not many successful. First there were fewer guards on the gates. They built the walls up, too, over time. Problem is, you get away, where is there to go? Even if you get past these sandy hills, the country's not welcoming. And the guards had rifles, sir. The guards had dogs." "But you got away, Ephraim." "Not far away. When I escaped, it was very near the last days of Pilgrisy Acres. Company men coming in from Richmond to the overseer's house, you could hear the shouting some nights. Rations went from meat twice a week to a handful of cornmeal a day and green bacon on Sundays. They fired the little Dutch doctor who used to tend to us. Sickness come to us. Let the old ones die in place. Took the bodies away to bury or burn. Pretty soon we knew what was meant to happen next. They could not keep us, sir, nor could they set us free." "That was when you escaped?" "Very near the end, sir. Yes, that's when. I did not want to go without Jordan. If I waited, I knew I'd be too weak to run. I told myself I could live in the woods and get stronger, and I would come back for Jordan when I was more myself." He held the lantern close to the board wall of the abandoned barracks. Percy was suffering more from his wound now than he had seemed to when he received it. He grimaced as I helped him follow Ephraim. We stood close to the wild man in his circle of light, though not too close. I was still conscious of his rifle, and of his willingness to use it, even if he was not in a killing mood right now. The writing on the wall consisted of names, hundreds of names. They chased each other around the whole of the barn in tight horizontal bands. I expect the overseers would have let us starve if they had the time. They were afraid federal men would come digging around. There ought to be nothing of us left to find, I think was the reasoning. By that time, the cholera had taken many of us anyhow, weak and hungry as we were, and the rest. Well, death is a house, Mr. Camber, with many doorways. This is my son's name right here. Jordan Nash was picked out by the yellow lantern light. "Dear God," said Percy Camber softly. "I don't think God come into it, sir." "Did he write his own name?" "Oh, yes, sir. A northern lady taught us both to read back in the Missouri camp. I had a Bible and a copybook from her. I still read that Bible to this day. Jordan was proud of his letters." Ephraim turned to me as if I, not Percy, had asked the question. "Most of these men couldn't write or read. Jordan didn't just write his own name. He wrote all these names, each and every one. A new man came in, he would ask the name and put it down as best he could. This grew as we came and went. Many years' worth, sir. All the prisoners talked about it, how he did that. He had no pencil or chalk, you know. Made a kind of pen or brush by chewing down sapling twigs to soften their ends. Ink he made all kind of ways. He was very clever about that. River-bottom clay, soot, blood even. In the autumns, the work crew, drawing water from the river, might find mushrooms which turned black when you picked them. They brought them back to Jordan. He's made fine ink, he said. The pride in Ephraim's voice was unmistakable. He marched along the wall with his lantern held high so he could see his son's work in all its complexity. All those names, written in the space between a man's reach and the floor. The letters were meticulously formed, lines as level as the sea. Some of the names were whole names. Some were single names. Some were the kind of whimsical names given to house servants. They all ran together to conserve space, so that in places you had to guess whether the names represented one person or two. John, Kincaid, Tom, Abel, Fortune, Bob, Swift, Pompey, Atticus, Joseph, Wilson, Elijah, Jim, Jim's son, Rufus, Moses, Dearborn, Moses, Rafferty. I don't know altogether why he did it, Ephraim said. I think it made him feel better to see the men's names written down, just so somebody might know we passed this way, he said. Jordan lived in this barracks from 8 foot down, and so did shockingly many others. This is why you shot at us, Percy whispered, kind of awe or dread constricting his throat. I make it seem dangerous up here, yes, sir, so that nobody won't come back and take it down or burn it. I suppose they will sooner or later, whether I scare anybody or not. Or if not that, and the weather will wear it down. Keep it best I can against the rain, sir. I don't let birds or animals inside, or even the daylight, sir, because the daylight fades things. That ink of Jordan's is sensitive to it. I'll be gone one day, I suppose. I will too, by and by. And yourself as well, of course. Perhaps we can make it last a little longer, Percy said. Of course, I knew what he meant. I'll need light, I said. The fierce, hot light of the fading day. Ephraim was anxious to help once Percy explained the notion to him. He threw open the barracks door. He took down the wood he had tacked over the south-facing windows. There were still iron bars in the window frames. In the corners, the light was not adequate, despite our best efforts. Ephraim said he had a sheet of polished tin he used for a mirror, which might help reflect the sunlight in. He went to his encampment to get it. By that time, he trusted us enough to leave us alone for a short time. Once again, I suggested escape, but Percy refused to leave, so I kept about my work. There were only so many exposures I could make. I wanted the names to be legible, and I could not capture everything, but I did my best. Ephraim told us about the end of Pilgacy Acres. He'd been nearby, hidden, half-starving in a grove of dwarf pines when he heard the initial volley of gunshots. It was the first of many over the several hours that followed. Gunfire in waves, and then the cries of the dying. By that sound, he knew he would never see his son Jordan again. Trenches were dug in the ground. Smoke from the chimneys lay over the low country for days. The owners had been hasty to finish their work, Ephraim said. They did not bother to burn the empty barracks before they rode off in their trucks and carriages. Ever since that time, Ephraim had sheltered in the barn of a poor white farmer who was sympathetic to him. Ephraim trapped game in exchange for this modest shelter. Eventually, the farmer lent him his rifle so that Ephraim could bring back an occasional deer, as well as rabbits and birds. The farmer didn't talk much, Ephraim said. There were age-browned copies of Garrison's Liberator stored in the barn, and Ephraim read them with interest, improved his vocabulary, his understanding of the world. Hardly anyone came up to Pilgacy Acres nowadays except hunters following the game trails. He scared them off with his rifle if they got too close to Jordan's barracks. There was no point leaving the barracks after dark, since we could not travel in the carriage until sunrise. Percy's condition worsened during the night. He came down with a fever. As he shivered, his wound began to seep. I made him as comfortable as possible with blankets from the carriage. Ephraim brought him water in a cracked clay jug. Percy was lucid. His eyes began to run in whimsical directions as midnight passed. He insisted that I take Mrs. Stowe's letter from where he kept it in his satchel, read it aloud by lamplight. It was this letter, he said, that had been the genesis of the book he was writing now, about the 3 million. He wanted to know what Ephraim would make of it. I kept my voice neutral as I read, so that Mrs. Stowe's stark words might speak for themselves. That is a decent white woman, Ephraim said when he had heard the letter and given it some thought. A Christian woman. She reminds me of the woman that taught me and Jethro to read, and Jordan to read. I don't know what She's so troubled about Mr. Camber. The idea there was no war. I suppose there wasn't, if by war you mean the children of white men fighting the children of white men. But, sir, I've seen the guns, sir. I've seen them used all my life. All my life. In my father's time and before him. Isn't that war? And if it is war, how can she say war was avoided? There are many casualties, sir. Their names are not generally recorded. Many graves, though not marked. Many battlefields, though not admitted in the history books. I will pass the thought on to Mrs. Stowe, Percy whispered, smiling in his discomfort, though she's very old now, might not live to receive it. And I decided I would pass it on to Elsbeth, my daughter. I packed up my gear very carefully come morning. This is Jordan's name, I imagined myself telling Elsie, pointing to a picture in a book, the book Percy Camber would write. This photograph, I would tell her, represent light cast in a dark place, like an old cellar gone musty for lack of sun. Sunlight has a cleansing property, I would tell her. See, I caught a little of it here. I suppose there was enough of her grandmother in her that Elsbeth might understand. I began to feel hopeful about the prospect. Ephraim was less talkative in the morning light. I helped pour shivering Percy into the carriage. I told Ephraim my mother had once published a poem in the Liberator years ago. Couldn't remember which issue. I may not have seen that number, Ephraim said. I'm sure it was a fine poem. I drove Percy to the doctor in Crib Lake. The doctor was an old man with pinch-nosed glasses and dirty fingernails. I told him I had shot my servant accidentally while hunting. The doctor said he did not usually work on colored men, but an extra $10 on top of his fee changed his mind. He told me there was a good chance Percy would pull through if the fever didn't worsen. I thanked him, went off to buy myself a drink.